This is Eat the Rules, a podcast about body image, self-worth, anti-dieting, and intersectional feminism. I am your host, Summer Inanen, a professionally trained coach specializing in body image, self-worth, and confidence, and the best-selling author of Body Image Remix. If you're ready to break free of societal standards and stop living behind the number on your scale, then you have come to the right place. Welcome to the show. This is episode 318, and I'm joined by Vincci Tsui, registered dietitian and certified intuitive eating counselor. We're talking about Vinci's experience working in bariatrics and what brought her to the anti-diet space, as well as her predictions for what will happen with the rise of weight loss drugs. We also talk about cultural sensitivity in nutrition spaces and whether we can trust nutrition evidence. You can find the links mentioned at summerinanen.com/318. I want to give a shout out to Candace who left this review. I've been wanting to write a review for a while now, but struggled to put into words how much I appreciate Summer's podcast. She perfectly phrases every idea in a way that's not only understandable, but so very relatable. I feel like she's speaking directly to me. I can't quite put into words how much her podcast means to me and how often I seek refuge in her words. I can't recommend this podcast enough. It's life-changing when you not only no longer feel alone in the struggle, but also get access to the strategies that make life happiness seem closer than you imagined. Thank you, Summer. You are incredible. Thank you so much. Wow. I'm just going to read that every night before I go to bed. That makes me feel really good. I had a bad day yesterday where I felt like nobody appreciated me. And so this really means a lot. I'm going to hang on to this one. Thank you, Candace. You can support the show via my Ko-fi account, ko-fi.com/SummerInanen. And that will always be linked in the episode information as well as in the show notes. And that will allow you to make a monthly contribution to the show for as little as $5 every month. You can help to keep this show on the air for another season. And you'll also get access to my mini course, Conquering Negative Body Talk. I appreciate everyone who has sponsored the show, even if it was just for $5 one time. It really helps and means a lot to me. You can also help the show by leaving a review or subscribing to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And I will always have free resources for you. You can get the free 10-day body confidence makeover with 10 steps to take right now to feel better in your body. Or if you're a professional who works with people who may also have body image struggles, you can get the free body image coaching roadmap at summerinanen.com/roadmap. You can find everything at thebodyimagecoach.com. I am looking forward to chatting with today's guest. We've been on each other's radar for a few years now and never actually had a conversation in person. So I was super excited to finally set this up. Vincci Tsui is a registered dietitian and certified intuitive eating counselor with over 15 years of experience based in the Mokitsisi, Gutsisi, Wichita Spa, or what is colonially known as Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Vincci is the founder of Weight Inclusive Dietitians in Canada and author of the Mindful Eating Workbook, Simple Practices for Nurturing a Positive Relationship with Food. Vincci takes a collaborative, compassionate, and inclusive approach to nutrition care that is person-centered and informed by anti-oppression, social justice, health at every size, intuitive eating, mindful eating, motivational interviewing, and trauma-informed care concepts. Through her work, she hopes to contribute to a world where everyone has equitable access to the resources necessary to honor their physical, mental, emotional, social, and cultural needs. Let's get started with the show. Hi, Vincci. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Summer, so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being here, fellow Canadian. Always nice to have some Canadian representation on the podcast. Why don't you tell everyone just a little bit about how you got into this work? Like, what was your relation? Did you have kind of a strained relationship with food and your body that brought you to this work, or what brought you to the work that you do now?
Yeah, so I guess I would say my path is a little different from a lot of people. I would say I've had a relatively good or neutral relationship with food and body throughout my whole life. And I think that's partly mostly because I have been protected by thin privilege in a lot of ways. I mean, I have anxieties in other areas of my life, don't worry, but food and body was not kind of where they showed up. And so how did I get into this work? I was just reflecting on this not too long ago. So my husband has family in BC. We live in Calgary in Alberta, just a province over for those of you who are not familiar with Canadian geography. And so we would go on these like 8 or 9 hour long drives, like to visit his family, and we would listen to podcasts. And normally we would be listening to like foodie podcasts a lot of the time. But this was back in fall 2016. I decided to like Google, or I guess podcast search, like podcasts that were hosted by dietitians. And I found the Food Psych podcast with Christy Harrison. And at that time, I think she had just done an interview with Evelyn Tribole, the co-author of Intuitive Eating. And Evelyn had actually I had actually seen her speak in person in Edmonton and read Intuitive Eating. And even then, again, it probably has to do with my thin privilege and my relationship with food. I read all of Intuitive Eating. I loved it. I had all these tabs throughout the book. It did not read to me like a weight inclusive or book. And so as I was listening to that interview, they were talking about how weight loss was not compatible with body positivity. And I was like, what? I thought I was, helping people feel positive about their body. I, always thought that anti-diet meant anti-fad diet. And as a dietitian, I wasn't putting people on fad diets. I was just teaching them how to eat healthy. And so it kind of got me, so I think kind of hearing that interview kind of got me down a rabbit hole of, I think I think I posted to a few dietitian Facebook groups at the time and was like, can you be body positive and still want to lose weight? And at the time, there were a lot of people who were like, well, yes, of course. You can be body positive and still want to improve your body. And I was like, well, is weight loss always an improvement? Or, you have to love your body in order to be able to lose weight, I think were some of the answers. And I was still like, oh, that's not right. And it was the few kind of no's that were in there that got me to dig a little further. And yeah, I think it was just being curious about this and I think feeling like I didn't want to be causing harm that kind of led me to this work. Because at the time, I was actually working at a bariatric surgery clinic. And so people would think, well, that's a complete 180 to do that. But it's interesting because I think the way that, the obesity sort of organizations have co-opted the concept of weight stigma and talking about weight stigma. So it kind of already planted the seed that weight stigma is a problem. And I think it was kind of learning more about body positivity, health at every size that got me to be okay, it's in these organizations are, talking about weight stigma, which is great, but they're still perpetuating weight stigma at the same time. And that kind of led me to where I am today. Kind of the short version, short but long version.
Well, that must have been a really weird moment then, because if you're working in bariatrics and then you start to have these moments of wait a minute, this is incongruent to my values, or I'm seeing that this is potentially causing harm. I guess I'm just curious, did you phase out? Did you just get out? How did you make that transition? I'm just so curious about that, because I was also a nutritionist who was focused on weight loss. And so it was this oh crap, what have I been doing?
Yeah, well, I think in some way, so I did probably after kind of that initial learning about body positivity and health at every size, I think I still stayed on at that bariatric surgery clinic for about 2 years after that. And sort of in that time, I think, I I tried to do both in that. What was nice about our clinic in a sense was that we didn't like set weight loss goals for patients. Like we didn't say, okay, like, or one of the things that's common in a lot of bariatric surgery clinics is they actually make you lose a certain amount of weight before you can even get the surgery. And so like one of the good things about our clinic was we didn't have like a pre-surgery weight loss goal for people. So weight wasn't necessarily a focus. And I think this again speaks to how the obesity organizations are co-opting the idea of weight stigma, is because, yeah, like they will say things that like BMI is trash, or, you know, it's about health. Like they kind of frame higher weight as like a quote unquote chronic disease. So they talk about, we're trying to, you know, manage your health and not like your weight. So we didn't like really focus on the number. And then I think in my role in itself, it was seeing people before and after surgery. So I almost thought of myself as more of a surgical dietitian, because I did used to work in upper GI surgery and acute care before working in bariatric surgery. So then it was like, okay, well, my job as a dietitian is to help you kind of before the surgery, make sure that you're going into the surgery well nourished. And then, you know, after the surgery, it's to make sure that you're coming out like still as nourished as you can, given sort of like the, like, I guess, restrictions that, you know, the surgery itself can cause, like with your eating. So I think that's how I kind of tried to frame the work that I did. I mean, I eventually did leave the clinic for many reasons, like including, yeah, just kind of feeling like just, I think being there was still, you know, in a sense, being supportive of like that weight centric approach. And yeah.
Yeah. So you have this really unique perspective because you worked in bariatrics, and I'm wondering, like, is there something that I'm sure there's a lot that that you're knowledgeable about and familiar with, but like, are there like some things that you wish people knew who were considering taking that route?
Yeah. I'm like, there, like, where do I even begin?
Yeah, right?
I mean, it's such a tough thing, because I think in a lot of ways, yeah, like I think one of the conversations that has kind of happened in, I think, weight inclusive spaces is, yeah, like we do wish that there were more weight inclusive, I guess, dietitians in these bariatric surgery spaces, because I think we do offer that different perspective that you don't necessarily get like from the clinic. I think one thing that can be very harmful is that most, if not all, like bariatric surgery centers, like they often have their own like patient support groups. If there aren't there, like there are so many forums online or Reddit groups or Facebook groups, and they are so specific that like they can be divided down to, you know, the month that you had your surgery. And like everybody's in these groups talking about, you know, like what are my goal weights, and, you know, what are the diets that I'm trying to do to, you know, maximize this surgery and make this surgery work for me. And it's like, yeah, a very harmful environment. And I think what's tough too is that a lot of times, like people who have had bariatric surgery, like, you know, obviously don't feel comfortable in weight inclusive health at every size spaces. I think the conversations are more nuanced now, but at one point, like, you know, and I think we still have this discourse that, you know, that bariatric surgery is like stomach amputation is, you know, a lot of ways that you call it. And so there's like such a strong reaction to it that, you know, even if someone has had surgery and they are, you know, wanting to, yeah, kind of enter, like wanting a different approach to health, kind of our weight inclusive spaces are not always welcoming to that. And yeah, and I think that's one piece of it. And I think there are like so many other pieces for like people who are considering surgery, like the risks. And I think there's so much hope going into the surgery that, you know, even though we talk about the risks, we talk about how like it's a very high percentage of people who will experience, say, like weight regain or whatever it might be. But, there's so much hope that, like, even if we say, like, I don't know the statistics off of the top of my head, but if we say like 1 in 4, 1 in 5 will experience like XYZ kind of complication, people don't think it's going to be them. Yeah. And I think that's hard too, is that like sometimes, like, even though we try to give as much informed consent as we can of the risks, like there's so much hope. And for a lot of people, like bariatric surgery or even the GLP-1s, they kind of feel like a last resort. And it's like, and, people think, oh, it couldn't be me, or I need to do everything I can in order to get the most out of this surgery, which leads to more restriction and restrictive behaviors above like the restriction that the surgery is already giving them.
Yeah. And I think it just speaks to like the crushing weight of weight stigma in our culture, that people are willing to, accept these pretty significant risks in order to potentially, feel safer in their body and feel more comfortable. And so I think it's like, again, it's like not an individual issue. It's like, it's really because of our culture that people go into it with that sense of hope, because they're just looking for a way to escape existing in a world where they're treated so poorly. So I totally understand that. You also, so because you have this unique perspective, you must sort of be watching everything that's happening with these weight loss medications like the GLP-1s, and perhaps seeing some parallels. Like, I'm just wondering, what do you foresee happening in the future with the rise of these weight loss medications?
Like, it's so wild how like quickly these weight loss medications are developing. I've been sort of looking at even the studies on semaglutide, which is like Ozempic and Wegovy. And right now they have a trial going on where they're looking at giving people 3 times the dose of Wegovy. So Wegovy is already high dose, like it's 2.4 milligrams a week. Now there's right now 2 trials going on that are looking at giving people 7.2 milligrams a week to see like what it's going to do. And then there's so many different medications that are taking, like we have the GLP-1. What happens if we combine that with, other like I don't even know the names off the top of my head, but like what happens when we combine them with other, similar hormones and like, yeah. And so there's just all these medications that are under development and, like you've probably seen those headlines where it's like, like, is this the end of like body positivity or whatever? And it seems, and like, it's funny because like we're kind of rolling our eyes, like, of course not. Like, we know we need it now more than ever. But I was recently in conversation with someone who like, it almost felt like they believed that. They were like, like, aren't these medications like, how is it affecting like your ability to, do like weight inclusive care or whatever? And I was kind of like, right now we're needing it more than ever because, like these are not the miracle drugs that people claim them to be. Like even based on what we know with Wegovy, like, or Ozempic, like even for people who are able to lose weight, you need to stay on it, like to, continue to maintain that weight loss. We know that a lot of insurance companies or whatever are not covering it. So it can get quite expensive. It's not very accessible. And I think with any weight loss method, it doesn't, for someone who is already in a larger body, it doesn't necessarily make them skinny, quote unquote. Like it might make them be in a less larger body, but that still doesn't erase the, weight stigma that they experience. And in fact, I think, weight stigma has the potential to intensify, because now it's like, well, we have these medications that can, make you thin, like, and they don't even necessarily do that for everyone. And it's like, why aren't you on it, kind of thing. So yeah, like I mean, I guess like my main hope is that like we don't kind of see these like, health side, like the long-term major side effects like we did with fen-phen or some of the other weight loss drugs from, yesteryear, because like, but I think, even without that, like some of the social issues and issues with stigma, I don't think it's the end for body acceptance. And in fact, like, I think, kind of the need for it is higher, but in so many, I think, different contexts. It's not as straightforward as like accept your body, even though it's never been that way. But I think like there's a greater need for like, I guess, more nuanced, difficult conversations.
Yeah, it absolutely. I totally agree with you, because I think that it's hard, right? Like you don't want to say like, hey, like you no one should take these medications, people are going to take them. So how do we meet people where they're at with what they're doing and maybe prevent some of the harm that's going to most likely happen as a result of taking them. And so it is hard. And I appreciate your wisdom there, having worked in that field in some way, shape, or form. One of the other things that I wanted to talk to you about was that you talk about quite a bit is the importance of cultural sensitivity in the anti-diet space. And so I guess first for people listening, like what can you just maybe define cultural sensitivity?
That's a hard one. I almost feel like I need to like Google it.
ChatGPT.
Okay, like what is cultural sensitivity? Okay, I'll try on my own first, and then if this is not a good answer, then maybe I'll like whip out the old Google. To me, like cultural sensitivity, it's, I guess, like being sensitive, being humble to other, like cultures, like different cultures, especially if they're cultures that are not your own. And I think like, recognizing and honoring the needs of like people who come from those cultures. And I think often we talk about cultural sensitivity or cultural humility or cultural competence, like in the context of different, I guess, like ethnic cultures, which I mean, yes, is important. And I think it can also apply to like different types of culture within, say, different marginalized communities. So like, because I think we hear about like, queer culture all the time, or like, I think, neurodivergent culture is like one of the things that are coming up. And I think, there is like a fat culture. And so I think it is, being sensitive to the needs of others and being conscious that like, I mean, like, I think we know this on an individual level, but what ends up like, to be sensitive to that, like, something that works for one person, like doesn't work for everyone. But I think where this gets all tangled up is when we're talking about, say, like science and evidence, like, cause like, being a dietitian, and I don't know if this is the same for like other health providers, but they like drill into us like from the get-go. And you see it in a lot of like dietitian marketing as well, that, like dietitians are, your evidence-based source of nutrition or whatever. And so what ends up happening, I think, is that, people feel like, oh, I need like the evidence is like what I need to listen to, but like what is forming the base of our evidence, right? Like, and who is doing the research and who is the research being done on? Like, I think, like women were only had to be included in like NIH, so the National Institute of Health funded studies. I think it was like in the early 80s, which is not very long ago, that like that like women were required to be included in studies. And like, even more recently, right? Like the news item that came out like just in the past year is like for like, it was only this year where they started testing absorbency of like period products, like on actual, like using actual period blood. Like before that, they were using saline. And so the problem with, just listening to the evidence is that like, you're like, well, like this is what works for a lot of people, or, this was like, we came up with this using a very scientifically rigorous method, but it still doesn't necessarily apply to, people who don't match up with the population that was studied, and doesn't honor like kind of those cultural needs. And so I think, yeah, that's the long answer to what cultural sensitivity is.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And also like that is just pervasive in the mental health field as well. When you look at who is participating in these studies, who is designing the studies, like it is very much colonial, perspectives. And that is something that I've been really keen on looking at. Like whenever I have to do a research paper is, okay, well, who's missing and what data is there? And, in like the eating disorder field and whatnot, like there's just a handful of studies that look at like Black and Indigenous people's experiences. Like you can probably count them on like two hands, maybe. Don't quote me on that, but there is like a paper that looks at like the bias in that. And so it is beyond nutrition, to your point, because you said like, I don't know if this is just in the dietetics field, but no, it is in mental health as well. And so I guess then like what I'm curious about, like you mentioned a couple things there, but like, where do you think some of the messaging is falling short as it relates to like mainstream nutrition advice, or even like mainstream like anti-diet advice? Like, do you feel like that is then falling short because of this reliance on like things that are evidence-based, but the evidence is more biased?
Mm-hmm. I mean, like so many things. Like even when I think about, like nutrition in general, right? Like people always say like the Mediterranean diet is like the healthiest diet or whatever. And like, even when and it's such a weird, like mixture, I think, of like colonialism and also, I don't know if like Orientalism is the right word, but sort of that like fascination with things that are ethnic, because like in some way it's like, oh, like Mediterranean, like there's this like sort of feeling like, oh, that's so. And maybe this is more of like a North American perspective, but it feels like, oh, like Mediterranean, it's so like, like they live like different lifestyles than us. Or I think even the fascination with like blue zones, sort of that like, putting kind of like, or sort of that, yeah, I don't know what the word is off the top of my head, but like that kind of putting the like, other cultures like on a pedestal, but it's like almost, just kind of taking the certain parts of it and not like appreciating the culture, like kind of as a whole. And I think like, when it comes to, being culturally sensitive around food, or around nutrition, like the first thing people do is like, oh, well, like I'll just make sure that I include people's like these ethnic foods or whatever. Like, okay, like I have, an Indian client, I'll make sure that like we have like naan and roti on the menu instead of just bread, and we're good. And it goes so far beyond that. Like, even if we're just talking about food, like our beliefs about food can be so different, how we eat, like some of the different eating patterns that different people have. And then like, going beyond that, what are like some of the cultural beliefs about like bodies and even, like how we interact with health providers, like people who are in positions of authority. Like, yeah, there's just so much. And it's unfortunate that at least I think in some nutrition spaces, it's just like, okay, well, I just, need to maybe go to an Indian restaurant. This is an extreme example, but like, it's like, oh, I just need to, visit like one of the ethnic grocery stores and then I'll understand. And it's like, no, that's unfortunately not the case.
Yeah, totally. And I feel like there's a lot of sweeping assumptions that can be made. And what I'm hearing is that it really is very like individual and nuanced. And it's more about like understanding someone's worldview and their own, traditions. And in order to be in a better place to maybe support them. Did you see the article where the person looked at the blue zones and found that it was complete crap?
I think I saw the headline, but I didn't click through to read it.
It's super interesting. Yeah, I will try to dig it up and put it in the show notes and I'll send it to you. But it basically, like, I may be summarizing this not perfectly, but that the regions that were blue zones, that they found to be blue zones, actually just had really flawed record keeping. So either a lot of the records were destroyed in, for example, the war, or there's a lot of like pension fraud. And so therefore it looked like people were living longer, but really they just didn't have accurate records. And yeah. So it's really fascinating. I read the article and I was like, what? Because they made like a whole Netflix documentary.
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
It's more just to your point about like what is evidence-based. And, obviously evidence-based is good, but we can also maybe like question the evidence or look at like the actual studies and how they were designed and things like that. And not everybody has time to do that, obviously, but for it's like people like yourself that will actually go and look at the research that I think is so valuable for other people. So in terms of cultural sensitivity, like for practitioners in the space, like what do you wish there would be? What kind of conversations do you wish you'd see more of?
I mean, I think like, I think practitioners need to, like go out of their way to like learn from people who are from other cultures. And again, like not just different ethnic cultures, even though that is very important, but also like, people who are from the LGBTQ plus community, people who are neurodivergent, from people who are disabled. I think those are, important cultures as well. And I think like listening to our clients and there is a difference between relying on our clients to teach us, which we don't want to do, and like listening to their stories, right? Because I think, that's why it's important to kind of do our own learning so that, we have an idea of like what is out there. But when it comes to like talking to our clients, like I think it's respecting that, like, no group is a monolith. I'm sure like my experience as a Chinese person or a person of Chinese descent is different from, other people. It's kind of like, listening to their stories because like, I think it's important to hear like the stories of the individuals that we are working with. And then also having that background knowledge to be like, oh, okay, like it makes sense. Like, why that is there, or like, or it can also make sense, like why it's different because, like we are living, even though I come from Hong Kong, like I've lived in Canada almost my entire life. And so, kind of that experience is different. So I think, if your client is open to sharing their story, like really paying attention to it and then using your own kind of background knowledge, research, learning to kind of, make those connections.
Yeah, that makes sense. Great. And so where can people find more of you?
I'm like, where am I these days? Like, we were just talking, I think, off mic about how like we've given up on social media. I mean, I think I'm most active if I am active on Instagram, like at Vincci RD. So that's VINCCIRD. People can also, learn more about how to work with me on my website. That's vincitsui.com or VINCCITSUI.com, because my name is not spelled how it's pronounced.
Yeah.
And I also run, I guess, a continuing education platform for dietitians called Weight Inclusive Dietitians in Canada, or WIDIC, and we are at weightinclusive.ca.
Great. Amazing. And so do you work with people, like if people are like, oh, I need a dietitian, like, do you work with people privately? I know you had like,
Yes.
an emotional eating group that you were doing. And so, okay. So people can find all that on your website there then.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being here. It was lovely chatting with you. And I'm so glad we had this opportunity to finally connect.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.
And rock on. That was a great conversation, and I hope you enjoyed it too. You can find the links mentioned at summerinnanen.com/318. Thank you so much for being here. Rock on. I'm Summer Innanen, and I want to thank you for listening today. You can follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Summer Innanen. And if you haven't yet, go to Apple Podcasts, search Eat the Rules, and subscribe, rate, and review this show. I would be so grateful. Until next time, rock on.